Hello everyone, welcome to this rather unusual Northern Echo Facebook Live. I'm Asia, and this evening I'm joined by some rather important people who are going to be chatting with us about the vaccination programme and the importance of having your COVID and flu vaccination. So our readers, you sent in some great questions over the last week. We've been absolutely inundated, and we're going to try our very best to get through as many as we possibly can. So without further ado, would you both like to introduce yourselves?
Yep. So Lorraine Hughes, I work as a public health consultant in a local authority.
And I'm Neil Watson, and I'm the COVID vaccination programme lead, which I've been doing, in fact, since September 2020 now, and was present at the very first vaccination in December the 8th, 2020. So been working on the programme for over 2 years now.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining me this evening. Really appreciate your time. So let's get on with the questions then, shall we? So we know that the NHS is facing a really tough winter as it is. In relation to people coming forward for their vaccinations, both of flu and COVID, when they get notified, how might that alleviate some of the pressure on the NHS?
Yes, Asia, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a lot of pressure on the NHS at the moment. The acute and emergency service is under significant pressure. We also know that the NHS is having to deal with a backlog that, of course, has been created by the pandemic. So all of that tells us about the importance of us all doing what we can to keep well. And we do that in a variety of different ways. But of course, this evening, the bit that we want to really impress upon people is the importance of having their COVID and their flu vaccines in preparation for winter.
Fantastic. Lorraine, anything to add on that?
I agree with what Neil said, and by coming forward and having their vaccinations, it'll help to stop people getting seriously ill and having to use healthcare services. So that's how everybody can play their part, and also, to stop passing COVID or flu on to others as well who might be ill themselves. So every time that people do get vaccinated and come forward, they are doing their bit to help.
Great. And what is the advantage of someone who is young and healthy being up to date with their COVID vaccines? Every time they get notified for a COVID vaccination, they make sure they get their appointment and get that sorted as soon as possible. If you take, for example, a healthy 25-year-old with no underlying health conditions that they know of, and they're fit as a fiddle, why is it still crucial for them to do that?
So from a public health perspective, there's a whole range of vaccinations that people are offered. And so we would want everybody to be up to date with all of their vaccinations. It's one of the most single important public health measures we have. In terms of the COVID vaccination, young, healthy people won't be invited generally for that. The vaccinations being offered to those who are most vulnerable, so that is older people, care home residents, for example, those with health conditions. So a young, healthy person wouldn't really be invited for it. They may be if they perhaps live with somebody who is vulnerable or they have carer responsibilities, then they might. But the offer for COVID is very much, in those older age groups and those who are more vulnerable and more likely to be seriously ill if they caught COVID. From a flu vaccination perspective, it's mostly the same groups, but we do invite children to come forward for that. So that offer is there for those aged 2 and over, and for the younger children, the preschool children, they would get that through their GP, and it's offered in schools from primary up to year 9 in secondary as well for children. And that's because we know younger children are also at risk of getting seriously ill from flu and can also pass it on to others who are more vulnerable. So the offer for COVID is different to previous and for the autumn booster. So everybody who is eligible will have had a letter or been communicated in some way and invited to come forward for their vaccinations.
Fantastic. Neil, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, really, just to echo Lorraine's comments, really, there is this misconception that actually we're going to be calling people who are young and healthy, actually, they're not eligible for the vaccine. So if you have been called, it's because the Joint Committee for Vaccination and Immunisation has deemed that you are one of the cohorts, one of the groups that are at risk of not just contracting COVID, but from the consequences of COVID. And so therefore, you're advised to be vaccinated. So that, yes, for COVID vaccination, and as Lorraine has outlined as well, for flu as well. So if you're called, it's because it's been recognised that you would benefit from being vaccinated, and to keep healthy and to make sure that we keep pressure off the NHS unnecessarily.
Great. Thanks for clarifying that. And Lorraine, you did touch on this a couple of minutes ago about flu.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, because a lot of people seem to think that flu is something that only badly affects either the very, very young or the elderly / immunosuppressed. So how much of a threat is flu to the average healthy person?
Well, thinking about those groups that you've mentioned that are more at risk of being seriously ill if they catch flu, that's absolutely true, and that's why they are invited for flu vaccination. Of course, anybody can catch flu. It doesn't mean that you won't catch it. You just might not be as seriously ill, but you might still be ill enough that you can't go to work, for example, or that you can't, you might struggle to carry out some caring responsibilities or childcare responsibilities that you have, enough to sort of disrupt your life if you catch that. But the other thing is, you can have flu. Some people get very poorly with flu, absolutely. Some people might have flu but not have any symptoms. So that's why, again, we would say if you are invited and you're eligible for the flu vaccination, please do come forward for it, because you might not be seriously ill with it, but you could pass it on to somebody else unknowingly, and they could be very ill.
It's a good point. Neil, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's very well covered by Lorraine.
Great. Now, there are fewer vaccination centres now than there have been in 2021. For people living in, rural communities, villages, if they get notified that it's time for them to come forward for their COVID vaccination, for example, and the nearest vaccine centre is quite a distance away, and if it's in a rural community, public transport might be a big issue, what advice would you give to those people who really want their COVID vaccination, but it's that much more difficult for them this year?
So perhaps if I just give you the kind of the journey that we've been on over the last 2 years. So when we began at the end of 2020, we literally had one centre which we opened, you'll recall, the hospital hubs largely. And then at the beginning of 21, we started to see some vaccination centres open and some general practices. And then over the course of the rest of that year, we also saw community pharmacy beginning to play a much larger role. So when it got to spring boosters in 2022, we had a very large network in northeast North Cumbria. Now, remember, that was to vaccinate the whole population, particularly during 2021. And so we needed a huge capacity to be able to vaccinate the whole population. This time, of course, we've got a slightly smaller group to deal with. It's about half, actually. And so our approach has been to constantly reflect on what we need to be able to vaccinate the population in a reasonable time frame. And remembering, we're doing this over a kind of 3-month period, September, October, November, and obviously into December a little bit as well. So the program has had to adapt over this time frame depending on which population it is we're vaccinating. However, when we did shrink the size of the network for this part of the program, for the autumn booster, we had a lot of experience based on how people travelled, how people moved, and where their preferences were. And we listened to local communities, and we listened to health professionals who've been working in those communities to judge and make sure that we created the network that still dealt with the population who were going to be requiring vaccination. And that's included all the experience we gained from rural communities during last year. So my advice is, and it's actually because we're vaccinating over a period of months, whilst you might not be able to get a slot in the vaccination centre when you have been called, whether through your general practitioner or through community pharmacy, through the National Booking Service, that very day, there will be appointments coming through. And so we advise people to keep checking back because we've got a number of weeks over which we're doing the programme. We've also got lots of other little twists and tricks that are in place in local communities. So, for example, there are some age concern buses that have been used in the Tyne Valley to move people from local communities to the centre, which is open in Hexham Mart in Hexham. So there's a range of things that have taken place. And I'm trying to think of an example more appropriate for your readership down in the Durham direction, but there are our colleagues in community pharmacy and in general practice are very clever at adapting to the needs of local communities, and so we try very hard to learn from the experience we've had and make sure that we make it as easy as we can. But of course, we can't put a vaccination centre in every single village. But if it's a remote village, very often we use mobile pop-up units. So we'll be visiting at certain times, and we'll of course advertise that very widely to make sure people know. So it's something we work very hard on, but it's not perfect, but we try very hard.
Yeah, and just to add to what Neil said, I think we're looking at the data and the information all the time and seeing where people are vaccinated and where they're not. We're getting feedback from people, and from a local authority perspective, we very much work into our communities, and we're working with our primary care colleagues and with the regional vaccination team. We've got provision, just from my example in Sunderland, across all of the key areas in Sunderland. We've got a number of venues that people can come to, and they've been appointments, and then hopefully we'll be moving to some walk-in provision soon. But we've had clinics that have moved around different areas, and we continue to do that. And we work with our voluntary community sector as well and get that feedback from them, see where people are going to. And at the moment, we're looking at how we can link them with some of the warm spaces and go and offer some vaccination there. So we're very much looking at, we've got our core sites, and they're there and they're accessible, and they're the sites that people were able to use in the earlier waves of the vaccination programme, as well as the bigger vaccination centres. We've got community pharmacies, as Neil has mentioned, and we are looking to take, vaccination teams to where people are, and we'll continue to do that. So for ourselves and for all of the other local authorities, I would just encourage people, if they're not sure where to go, there's information on all of the council websites, and we keep that up to date every week about where the latest sort of clinic sessions are and where people can go to. And as walk-in provision becomes available, we'll keep that up to date on there as well.
Excellent. Well, we had a lady get in touch from Middleton St George, which is a village just outside Darlington, and she was the one who asked that question. So fingers crossed that was helpful for her. So check council websites. That's where the most up-to-date information will be on that. Great. I should just mention to our viewers as well, if you have any questions, pop them in the comments section, and we will do our best to get through all of them. So in the meantime, main side effects of the COVID vaccine. If, for example, someone is having their first one, say they did get notified previously because they're at risk, but for whatever reason they decided against it, and now they're coming forward, what side effects should they be aware of, and how should they best tackle that?
So I think the first thing to say is that everyone's very different in this regard. So just because you're having the vaccine doesn't mean to say you'll react exactly the same way as your friend did. But it's quite common to get a bit of a soreness around the arm that's had the injection into. Equally, sometimes, and I have my annual flu booster, there are some years where actually you don't feel a thing, and other years you do. So it's not consistent, even in one individual. So you sometimes get a bit of a sore, heavy arm. You also sometimes feel a bit tired and a bit flu-like for 24 hours, but it's generally mild. But certainly what I would say is that I would advise everybody to pre-dose with a dose of paracetamol before your vaccination. I certainly always take a dose of paracetamol about half an hour to an hour before the vaccination, and then I'll keep that paracetamol dosing going over the 24 hours immediately afterwards. And I think if you do that, that generally allows you to continue absolutely as normal, even though you can sometimes feel a bit fluey, I think is probably the best way of describing it. Sometimes a bit headachy. But these symptoms are generally very mild.
And so that's for COVID. What about the flu vaccine? Is that generally the same?
I would say exactly the same, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Great, well, short and sweet. Thank you. And what about pregnant women then? Why is it important that they make sure they have their vaccinations? And are there any potential side effects for them?
The message, for pregnant women is, they're offered COVID and they're offered flu and they're offered whooping cough vaccination as well, actually. And they've been offered flu and whooping cough for a number of years now, and obviously COVID more recently. So we would encourage them to come forward and have all of their vaccinations. It's safe for them to have COVID and flu together. If they've got any concerns or questions, it's really important that rather than decide not to get vaccinated because of those questions, that they speak to their midwife or their GP, who will be more than happy to discuss this with them. But it's the most important thing they can do. We know that that there has been serious complications for the pregnant woman and baby in many cases when they have caught COVID or flu. So it is absolutely safe for them to have these vaccinations. We're making it easier than ever. So again, I can talk from my example in Sunderland. I know this year within our maternity services, they're going to be offering the vaccinations on the community visits and in their antenatal clinics. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible for the women to have the vaccinations when they're coming in and seeing their midwives anyway. And so, please do come forward and do that. And if you've got any, questions, which we can understand, but talk them through with a health professional, because there can, particularly in the third trimester, if somebody caught COVID, we know they can get seriously ill with that, and there can be serious complications as well if they catch flu. And it's a time when pregnant women are doing everything they can to keep themselves and their babies well, and this is a really important example of how they can do that.
Fantastic. So really emphasising the fact that for pregnant women, they'll be doing not just themselves a big favour, but also for their unborn child as well.
Absolutely.
Neil, do you have anything to add to that?
No.
Great, again, short and sweet. So if someone, you mentioned it's perfectly safe to get the COVID vaccination and your flu vaccination at the same time. Is it possible that if you are someone who generally tends to have a bit of a bad reaction to vaccines, is it possible that the likelihood of that would be increased having two at the same time?
I think, Asia, as I said a little while ago, even as an individual, 1 year to the next, you might react 1 year and not the next. So it's actually really difficult to say, and to say just because you've had a bad reaction before, you have a bad reaction again, or a difficult time for that period immediately after the dose. What I would say is I would encourage people just to get both done at the same time. However, there is a personal choice in this, and if in fact people don't want to have them at the same time and rather would separate them, then actually it wouldn't be for me to dissuade them of that. I think that is a personal choice issue. But having had both at the same time, I would probably reassure that actually how I felt for the 24 hours immediately afterwards was no worse than I felt with individual doses of flu in the past when I've had a reaction. So actually, I think the evidence for giving vaccines together generally, I mean, we make a bit of a fuss about having flu and COVID at the same time, and yet of course we've been using joint vaccinations and multiple vaccinations in adults and in children for decades, and we know that those vaccines are both safe and extremely effective when given together. So certainly co-administration is something that I certainly wouldn't be concerned about, but equally understand if people would prefer to have them separated.
And obviously with flu vaccines, people who are at risk get notified each year, usually October, November time. Is it likely that for COVID boosters that will be the same going forward? It will be tweaked each year and you'll have to have a booster each year?
Again, if I pick this up on it initially, yeah, I think it's reading the tea leaves would suggest to me that we're likely to have a seasonal autumn booster every year, COVID and flu. We don't know how that will be presented. I don't know if next year whether it might be a combined vaccine. We at this stage we just don't know, and we don't even know for sure whether my prediction is going to be correct. That decision hasn't been made yet, and that will be made by the Joint Committee and Committee of Vaccination and Immunisation, the JCVI, which people often talk about and I'm sure hear about in the news. So we're still waiting for that guidance, but I think it's my view is it's highly likely that we'll see an autumn booster. What happens in between is anyone's guess, because we've often found that when we make predictions like that, things happen in the meantime, and then we have to make changes to plans. So, but certainly a seasonal autumn booster would seem to me highly likely.
And so I just wanted to add, I suppose, on the previous question about, it being safe to get the vaccinations together. So absolutely it is, and it would be great if people could get that. But I just wanted to reinforce the message that we don't want people waiting to get them together. So if it's not possible to get them both together, and I know that might be more convenient for some people, but we really wouldn't want anybody delaying either of the vaccines to wait to get them together. So, just get both of them, if you're eligible for both, as soon as you can, and don't put it off.
Fantastic. And we do hear people talking now, as we are nearly, well, as of March next year, it'll be 3 years since the first lockdown was announced. We hear people talk about the pandemic as if it's all in the past. It's no longer an issue, no longer anything to worry about. I was just wondering what your reactions are when you hear that kind of thing. What's your first thought?
I think, my first thought is I can understand why people want to feel and think like that, because, it was a time we probably never thought we would see anything like that, and we don't want to see anything like that again. It had an impact on everybody. And, I think people are really enjoying having, what would be their usual routines and, being able to go about their daily life as they normally would. So I can absolutely understand that. And, we are in a very different place, thankfully, but I have to say, that is primarily down to the vaccinations and, people's cooperation and how they followed, the guidance and did everything they could to help each other, help their families, help the NHS. I think, it goes without saying that is really appreciated, and it helped us all the way through. But, the vaccinations coming on stream, that was game changing really for it. And that is what has allowed us to get to this point now. However, COVID is still circulating. We're at the time of year where flu is circulating, and we are still seeing people seriously ill with it. And we probably all know people, I know quite a few people just in the last few weeks who've had COVID and have been quite poorly with it. And people are still being admitted to hospital with it. So it is still there, obviously not at the levels that it was, but it is still impacting on people's lives. And having, a long-term impact for lots of people as well. So we're in a really good place, and we need to continue to work together. And part of that is, if you're eligible, as we've said, come forward for your vaccination. We're really lucky to have this vaccination program, aren't we? And to be able to have it. And let's just take up that opportunity and to be able to continue as we are, because we're all enjoying those freedoms that we took for granted and having them back.
Absolutely. And that ties in with a question we've just had from a viewer asking, I've had 2 jabs, presume COVID vaccinations that's referring to. Do I need another one? Now, we've obviously mentioned come forward for your vaccination as soon as you're notified. So do you have anything to add on his question?
Sorry, do you want to go on, Neil?
Go on, Lorraine.
Well, I was going to say, so most, depending on age, so obviously younger children weren't eligible for 3, but most people. So for myself, I'm not eligible with my age for the autumn booster, but I was eligible for 2 boosters and then a 3rd booster. So most adults were eligible for a 3rd. And if they haven't had that, there are clinics and appointments available for people to still come forward and get that. So what we would want people to do is to be fully vaccinated for what they are eligible. But that does vary for everybody. So some people have had a 4th one. So it's about what they are eligible for individually. So I would guess if it's an adult that they would have been eligible for a 3rd vaccine. And then, as we said before, those who are eligible for the autumn booster, they will have been informed about that. So if they've had that communication, again, come back for that. But if they haven't been communicated with, then that means that they're not eligible for the autumn booster at this point.
So reinforcing, just when you get notified, make sure you come forward.
Yes.
Great. And, some people seem to think that if they say they get notified, they're eligible for a COVID booster, but they, for whatever reason, decide against it. If they think that by getting the virus naturally, that will improve their natural immunity, is there any truth to that? And what would you say to someone who had that opinion?
So shall I begin, Lorraine?
Yeah.
So I can understand why that thinking might be there, but what we mustn't forget is this virus is constantly changing. And the clever scientists to do the work on developing these vaccines are constantly trying to keep up to date with making sure the vaccines that are available do as much as they possibly can for the variant that is appearing. So therefore, whether you've had COVID before, depending on which variant you had, actually doesn't mean that you're necessarily well protected, which is why the JCVI still recommend that if you're called for a vaccine, irrespective of whether you've had COVID before or not, that's there to protect you from, as much as possible, from the latest variants that are coming through. The only caveat I'd say to that to you is if you've had COVID very recently, you usually leave a 4-week window after you've had COVID before we then wish to vaccinate you.
And so what I'm going off-piste here, but what would happen if, say, somebody recovered from COVID 2 weeks ago and decided to ignore NHS advice and get their vaccine too close to when they recovered? What would be the potential dangers of that?
It's not about dangers; it's about effectiveness of the virus, actually, of the vaccine. So it's good practice to leave that time period for your normal immune response, which happened during the COVID, to then have died down for your body to react to the vaccine in order to start creating the right immunity following the vaccine. It wouldn't do you any harm, but actually at the same time, it'd be unlikely that somebody would be vaccinated, because that's part of our standard questioning when you go to a vaccination centre. Have you had COVID recently, and when did you last have COVID? This is largely about optimizing the outcome that you get from having the vaccine. It's less about side effects from the vaccine because you've had COVID very recently.
Right, I see. Lorraine, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I agree with everything Neil said.
Lovely. Great. Well, to our viewers watching, thanks very much for tuning in, everyone. You've sent through some great questions, so I hope we've managed to get all of them answered. Lorraine and Neil, thank you both so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I hope we've clarified some queries there. So yes, thanks very much for joining me this evening, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Bye.